Welcome to Make.Do's Word of the Year virtual class. In your kit, you will have your Word of the Year written on your fabric of choice inside your hoop. You'll have whichever thread you picked. You will also have a needle threader and your needle. What you do not have and what you will need is a pair of scissors. I have both a little pair of scissors and a big pair of scissors that I'm going to use later, but if you only have one, totally fine. If you only have one, well, you have what you have. So if you have little and big, grab both, and if not, just grab what you have. That will be sufficient. Go ahead and grab your hoop. If your fabric is not already in your hoop, or if you kind of want to rearrange it, take your hoop and unscrew this one just enough to pop that out. This is gonna go underneath our fabric, so the inside ring goes underneath the fabric. My fabric goes right side up on top of it, and I'm trying to eyeball it being center, so I can kind of push around to see where my hoop is, adjust as needed. Then I'm gonna take my hoop, my outer ring, and stick it on top. There we go. And now I can tighten my screw. First order of business is to talk about keeping tension on our fabric. I want to make sure that my fabric stays relatively taut. I don't want it to be really loose and sagging in my hoop, but I don't want to pull it so tight that it starts to distort my fabric. So one way that I can help manage that tension on my fabric is to try to keep my fingers on the wooden part of my hoop as I'm stitching instead of pushing against my fabric. Sometimes you'll need to use your fingers to help pull your embroidery thread through, but for the most part, we want to keep our fingers on the wooden part of our hoop. Grab your thread, find an end of my thread. I like to keep it, if I can, inside of the skein, so I don't pull these plastic parts off, and I'm gonna end up pulling it one full time, and then I'm gonna grab here and I'm gonna pull another time. So that ends up being about one, can you see that? 1 arm's length for me. So the tendency, because threading our needle can be such a chore, is to get a lot of thread so that we don't have to keep threading our needle. But if you do that, then your thread is likely to get tangled up and make a big mess on the bottom of your hoop. So I find an arm's length to be a very usable amount of thread. So to use our needle threader, that is this thing that came in your kit. I'm gonna take my needle, so you can see, there's the eye of my needle. I'm gonna take the big hook, I'm gonna stick it through the eye of my needle. If for some reason the big hook won't go through the eye of the needle, you can flip it over and use the small one. I just find it easier to use the bigger hook. Then I'm gonna take my thread and I'm gonna put it on my hook, and I'm gonna use my hook to pull my thread through. Ta-da! As soon as that little tail comes through, I can take my needle threader off and set it to the side. So I have my needle with a little tail and then this long strand hanging down from that. I'm going to tie a double knot on this side of the long one. So that little short tail is staying free, and this other side is getting a double knot tied in. So as I stitch, I'm gonna have this end with my little short tail, and then I have my long end that has my knot on it. This is obviously gonna catch on the fabric on my first stitch. The key is that as I'm stitching, I wanna make sure that this tail always stays free. So I don't want it to get caught up in my fabric to where I can't see that tail free. When we're teaching the kids classes, I tell the kids that it's like if your dog, so this is your tail, like your dog has a tail, and how would your dog feel if you put shorts on your dog and his tail couldn't be free? So I'm saying that to you now. Don't put shorts on your dog. let the tail stay free. So today I'm going to cover 3 stitches: back stitch, stem stitch, and French knot. You'll only need to use the French knot today if you have a letter with a dot, like a J or an I. Are those the only letters with dots? I think so. J and I. Yeah. So if you do not have a J or an I, you don't have to worry about a French knot. You get to choose, though, if you want to do back stitch or stem stitch. Here are reasons to choose each one. Here are some examples of back stitch. And this would be the most basic of stitches, is back stitch. So if you've never embroidered before, I suggest that you at least watch me teach the process of back stitch. I'll give a lot of troubleshooting tips in the back stitch part of the video. If you have embroidered before and want to step it up a notch, then you have the option, move those out of the way, to do stem stitch. This is my favorite stitch. So see how it kind of looks like a rope is coiling around the letters here. Stem stitch is great because it really goes around curves really well. It's also good if you, as a beginner, don't have a super even stitch length. So here's what I mean by that. On back stitch, see how you can see all of my stitches, like where one ends and where the other begins? So if my stitches, if some of them were really long and some of them were really short, that's gonna be obvious when you are using back stitch. On stem stitch, you can't really see where one stitch begins and the other one ends. So it's a lot more forgiving when it comes to an uneven stitch length. In fact, we make our stitch length uneven on purpose when we do stem stitch. So another thing to keep in mind when you're trying to decide if you want to use back stitch or stem stitch is your fabric and the color of thread that you have. So if you have a really kind of busier fabric, then using stem stitch, because it's a little bit thicker, is going to help your word stand out more than back stitch would. This is my back stitch, and my stitch looks a little bit thinner than my stem stitch that looks thicker. So depending on what look you're going for, if you want a really sleek, thin stitch, stick with back stitch. Otherwise, go with stem stitch. You also could do one, and if you decide you don't like it, take it out and do the other. Enough chatting. Let's get started. If you are left-handed, everything stays the same. I will point out what might be different for you. Right now on back stitch, I don't think anything would be different. It doesn't really matter with back stitch where you start or stop, which direction you work. So I'm gonna work left to right, just like I write. But if you want to start at the end of your word and work the other way, it doesn't really matter. I'm gonna start exactly where I would start if I was writing. So way over here on the left side of my hoop. So I'm always starting underneath and I'm coming up right at the end of my line. There's the needle. So again, as I pull, I'm holding on to my hoop. I'm trying not to keep my hands here. And I'm gonna go forward. I'm gonna advance along my line 1 stitch length. Okay, I know a stitch length, you're maybe wanting me to give you an exact measurement. A stitch length is kind of arbitrary. You are just trying to stay consistent. See how my thread is already starting to knot up. I want to try to avoid that as much as I can. So going slow and taking your time is going to help that not happen so much, but that is where knots are created. So that is my stitch length. If I were measuring it, I would say it is about 1/4 of an inch. Now from the back, I'm gonna advance forward along my line 1 stitch length. So the same distance as this little stitch I did, I have now come forward the same amount. I'm gonna pull my thread up. And I'm gonna turn it over just to make sure, yep, there's no excess on the back. And then now, this is why backstitch gets its name, I'm gonna go back into the exact hole where my first stitch goes down into my fabric. And there we go, our first 2 stitches. So I'm advancing forward on my line, 1 stitch length. And then I go back. We're using all 6 threads, so this embroidery thread that we're using is 6 strands twisted together. We're using all 6 of them so that we can get the thickest line possible. Otherwise, our that heat transfer marker that we used to put your word on your fabric would show through a little bit. So I'm trying to stay right in the middle of that line. You know, that line has a little bit of thickness to it. I'm trying to stay right in the middle. I'm keeping my stitches as even as I can. I'm checking to make sure that my thread isn't getting all twisted or tangled. If you're ever pulling through and you feel resistance, then that means that there's probably a knot forming on the back. So don't tug through that, don't fight it, flip it over and see what's happening. Okay, so it's just this, over and over and over. And it's hard doing it where that camera can see, but I tend to kind of hold it on my bosom. And again, I'm trying not to push up on my fabric. I'm really doing the best that I can to keep my fingers on my hoop. You get to stare at your word for a while, so take this time to let that word sink in as you stitch it. My fabric is starting to get a little loose, not evenly taut, so I'm just gonna give a light tug around, you know, the part of the hoop where it feels loose, and then keep going. Again, the trick here is to stay as even as possible. So we don't want any place that's tighter than another place on your hoop. We want to try to keep it as even as we can. I rotate my hoop so that I can get to whatever area I'm working on. On backstitch, like I said, it doesn't matter if you go left to right, up to down, right to left. As long as you're just following your line, it will be okay. So you'll pick up on this pretty quickly, but one of the things that makes your thread feel extra knotty, you know, knotty? Yeah, knotty, like it doesn't behave, but also it makes knots. So both of those are appropriate, is when these ends start to unravel. So sometimes if these ends get extra unruly, I'll grab my scissors and just cut that part off. And then that will help it feel like I'm not just fighting the knots the whole time. Good. Everyone's still recording. That's the worst. Or I guess what would be worse if there was no audio. Is the audio? Yep, we still have audio. So we got these new microphones after the all the classes we did for Make.Do in December. And the audio was kind of bad. And I had fought the idea of having to get one of these mics because I think they're ugly. And then I had to tell myself, it's not always about what looks the best because we're a creative studio, not a professional filming studio. So you just get to see my microphone. But hopefully I sound amazing. So when you get to a spot where your letter is gonna cross over something that you've already done, nothing changes. I made that sound bigger than it was. I do try to kind of split the difference there, so I'm going up right in the middle and back down. And then I'm gonna jump. This stitch is actually gonna be a little bit big because I'm jumping all the way to the opposite side of my line. And then back into the previous stitch. So I have just stitched over my line, which if you think about it, if you were writing that letter, that's what would happen too. Your pencil would go over the line that it had already done. I like to end my thread, if I can, at the end of a letter. So I don't know, I think I'll have enough, we'll see. It's like playing chicken with your thread. Don't think we're gonna make it. So I'm gonna take one more stitch and I'm just gonna stop here. So I have two options. I'm gonna show you one now and then I'm gonna show you another when we get to the end of this letter. So one of my options is to go ahead and unthread this. I didn't tie it or anything. I'm gonna grab my thread and find my end, pull out my arm's length, thread my needle. Instead of tying a knot in this end, I'm gonna tie it to this end. We're just gonna keep trucking along here like nothing has changed. So this is where I would take my next stitch. I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Before I get too overzealous and pull this all the way through, I'm gonna flip it over, and now I have a tail here and my tail here. I'm gonna tie these together in a nice little knot. It's gonna hit right on the tied right up against my fabric. Okay, now I can cut these extras off and we can keep going. So as I get near to the end of my letter that I'm working on, I want to make sure that I don't end up with same size stitches, and then a teeny tiny stitch. So I'm starting to make my stitches a little smaller so that it looks even when I get to the end of the letter there, and I don't end up with a weird itty bitty stitch. So at the end of this letter is a good time for me to show you another way that you can tie your thread off when it's time for new thread. And also when I get to the end of a letter here, just like I would pick up my pencil and start fresh here on my E, I am gonna start with a fresh knot and everything at the top of my E here. Otherwise, if I were to just pull my thread over and start stitching, I could get some ghosting. What I mean by that is I could be able to see my thread. You can see how you can see the thread there? That's what I call ghosting, and I don't want to see any of that. It would probably be okay if you have a darker fabric, it would be, but it's not any harder to do it this way. So here's the second way that you can tie off instead of doing how we did where we just tied the two ends together. I'm gonna take my needle and I'm gonna weave it through some of these old stitches that I just did. So this is a way that you can move along your letters too, if you want to go embroider somewhere else, like maybe cross a T or something, I can weave my way up to wherever my T crosses over. So now I'm just gonna kind of go in the same spot over and over. You can, I actually, see I made that loop there? I'm gonna stick my needle through it twice and that will let me tie a knot. So there's one, there's two, and then now as I pull this tight, didn't want to cooperate. As I slide that down and pull it tight, I just made a knot there. And then now we'll tie a knot in here. So there are proper or right ways to start your embroidery, to finish your embroidery, to change threads. We're not really worried about that because we are wanting to make this pretty. It doesn't have to go in the washing machine. It's not a dish towel that your great grandma made that needs to last for forever. So we're not so concerned with things being the right way. We're just going for like, it looks pretty on the front side. So now I am ready to start on my new letter. So I would come up here on my E and just keep going. So anytime we are at a corner, like we've been working on curves. I mean, we stopped here and we started again here and worked a curve. But anytime we hit a corner, here, a hard place where we're having to change direction, we're gonna wanna start fresh. When I start my new line, instead of starting from the top and coming down, especially if you're not switching thread yet, if you start there, you're gonna end up undoing your last stitch. So I'm gonna come down 1 stitch length and end up working back right into the corner to meet where my last stitch was. So it still looks like back stitch. There's no gap there. That's just what will help keep your stitches from undoing themselves. So I'll show you again when I get down to the end of this M. So remember, as I get to the end, I'm always thinking about how many stitches are gonna fit there. Is it gonna look consistent? I'm gonna split this into 2 stitches. Okay, so I'm at the bottom of my line there. So as I start my M, I'll start up here a little bit. And I don't want my line to get extra thick here. So as I start my stitch here, I probably won't put it back in right here all the way at the bottom. It'll go about into that second stitch there. So I'm going up, kind of almost up underneath my previous stitches because I don't want to see a gap. I think you have the gist of the back stitch, and so now we're gonna move on to stem stitch. And for that, I am going to grab my second hoop. Now, this is gonna sound confusing when I say it to you at first, so I think I can just show it to you on this. Let me find one that's a better color. Okay. Stem stitch ends up being the reverse side from back stitch. I already know that that sounded more confusing than it needs to be. So let me show you. When I flip this over, see how when we look at the back, it looks like back stitch. It looks like what we just did. If I take one that was done in back stitch and flip it over, it doesn't really look like stem stitch because we haven't been paying attention to what is happening on this side. Okay, this is where being left-handed might end up being backwards from what I'm gonna show you, only in the sense of the direction that you work. So I am gonna continue working left to right. If you're left-handed, it might be easier to work right to left. I'm right-handed, so I'm gonna work right to left, always. So there's no up or down, there's only left to right. So I'm gonna start at the top of my A right here, which is where I would start writing. But I'm gonna turn my hoop upside down so that I can work from left to right. If you need to work right to left, you could turn your hoop this way and you would start here and you would work right to left. So the only thing it changes is the direction that your hoop is turned when you start. This first stitch and every first stitch of like once we make a curve or something is gonna be different. And then after that, it all stays the same. So these steps that I'm gonna give you on the first stitch only apply to the first stitch. This is the part that can be a little bit confusing. I'm making a stitch length, just like we did on back stitch. But instead of pulling my thread all the way through, I'm gonna leave a little loop here, okay? I want my loop to always be underneath my working line. So my loop is always gonna be hanging down. It doesn't matter if I'm working left-handed, right-handed, my loop is always gonna be below my working line. I'm bringing my needle up in the middle of that stitch. I'm gonna pull, and I'm gonna pull that loop. Now, whoop, let's try to make a knot. Did I get it? Okay. There we go. Pull my stitch up. So my line, my thread, is on top of that stitch that I just made. So now I'm gonna hold the end of this out of the way, and I'm gonna make one stitch length. I'm gonna go back down. This time, I'm not coming up in this middle no man's land. I'm coming up exactly where my last stitch ended. Okay, so I go one stitch length forward, hold my loop down, and I come up right where my last stitch ended. This is where all that confusing stuff I was saying about this being the opposite of back stitch. When I flip this over, see how we're making little back stitches? Because we're always going back in where that last stitch ended. And so I go forward, and then from the back, let me show you, I'm gonna go back in like we did on backstitch where that last stitch was. So remember I was talking earlier about how this thread is 6 threads twisted together. And so what that means is sometimes when you pull it through, they don't all get pulled through at the same speed. So sometimes you might have a little piece of thread that's like sticking up. If you catch that in time, you can pull it, try to figure out which one it is and pull it tight, but sometimes you won't notice until a few stitches later, and then it'll look, you know, it looks a little hairy. But that's okay, because stitch after stitch after stitch, you won't notice that anymore. But you'll notice that that's why I'm taking extra care as I pull these tight, to make sure I kind of like pull it close and kind of jerk it to make sure that I'm getting all of those as much as I can pulled tight. So one thing with stem stitch that will help how things look overall is that as you come into curves, so like this curve here that's at the bottom of the A, it gets a little bit tighter than this gentle curve that we've been working here. So as I move into a tighter curve, I'm gonna take smaller stitches, and those smaller stitches are gonna help my stem stitch really hug my line, and it will make it to where I can't see this, my thread kind of pulling off to the side. So if you notice that your thread, that you can see it pulling underneath your stem stitch, try taking smaller stitches, and that will help. So especially down in the bottom of this A, I'm gonna get a little bit smaller. And remember, as long as I stay working the same direction, my thread always stays underneath my needle, and that is what makes my rope look like, my stem stitch look like it's a rope coiling in one direction. If I let my thread accidentally jump to the top of my line, then my rope is gonna look like it's changing direction halfway through. If you pull any of your stitches too tight, it's gonna tug your fabric, and you'll kind of be able to see. So if I were to pull this way too tight there, see how it put a little pucker in my fabric? So if you're getting puckers in your fabric, loosen up your tension as you're pulling those threads through. One of the things I love about hand embroidery is it's so portable. Like a lot of the crafts that we teach here at Make.Do, or you know, the creative hobbies that we have, kind of take up a lot of space. It's not like you can take your sewing machine with you in the car or to the doctor's office, but hand embroidery is a nice portable thing. Let you be creative anytime you have to wait. It's way better than doom scrolling Instagram. As I get to the end of a letter, well, and this isn't necessarily the end of my A, it's just a place where my pin, or in this case my thread, is going to change direction. I'm gonna make this stitch be a little bit bigger because I want my last stitch to be just the teeniest, tiniest stitch forward. So you can see I haven't gone all the way to the end of my line there. I still have a little bit left. So I'm gonna make this last stitch. And then now I'm gonna take just one teeny tiny stitch forward into that place where I started. Okay, so there is the first part of my A finished. And then now I'm gonna start coming down my line here. So this is, again, like I said at the beginning, that first stitch is always a little bit different. We're repeating that first stitch here, only backwards. Don't let that confuse you. Here's what I mean. Instead of starting at the front of the line, the top of the line, because we just went in there, so we can't come back through there, it would just pull it out. I'm gonna start kind of down here, okay? Starting down on my line a little bit. And then I'm gonna work back. I'm I'm trying to tuck this up under my stitches so that it doesn't look like there's a space. You don't see any blank space. And then remember on that that's gonna be a knot. Okay. And then remember on the first stitch, we come up halfway in between in that nothing land and pull tight. Okay, so then there's my first stitch, and now I can keep going. So here's one thing that I really like about stem stitch. As I have a long straight away, I can start to take bigger stitches and save myself some time. Whereas if I was doing back stitch, you would be able to tell that I was taking bigger stitches and being a little bit lazy. Also, as you start to get toward the end and your thread starts twisting, just take the time to manage it. I can also hang it upside down and let it untwist. I'm gonna go ahead and change my thread on here, even though I could do a few more, but just for the sake of time and video, I'm going to get my needle to the back, but I'm going to maintain my loop here, okay? So I'll flip this over and get my needle off. So I've unthreaded my needle, but I'm keeping my loop here because remember, we want to be able to just pick up as if nothing has happened. So now the tricky part, where is my thread end? I cannot find it. Good gravy. Okay, there it is. So I'm gonna pull my arm's length, cut that a little longer so I can find it next time. This is the exciting times. It's so glamorous. So now, just like we did on backstitch, I'm gonna act like nothing has changed. And I'm bringing my needle up, but before I accidentally pull it all the way through, I'm gonna go ahead and flip it over. So this is my new one. This is my old thread. You can tell because this one's real unraveled and this one looks fresh and clean. So now I'm gonna flip it over so you can see, but I'm gonna go ahead and pull this tight. There we go. Okay, so now it's tight. We left that loop just so we could make sure that our needle came up on the right side. And then now, just like we did before, I'm gonna tie this into a knot. Ta-da! And now I can cut this off and keep stitching. So here's an example like I was talking about before. See that thread that didn't get pulled as tight as everything else? It's okay. I'm not gonna worry about it. I wait until I get to a natural end of a letter if I can to change my thread. So like the end of the B here, maybe the top of the I right there, where the D hits the E. Those are places where I'm gonna have to start over anyway. So if possible, I will wait to change my thread until I get to one of those places. But it doesn't always happen. So sometimes you have to change in the middle and it ends up being no big deal. But anytime I get to the end of one of those points, I will do just like we did here on the A. Okay, last thing, French knot. Not last thing, second to the last thing, the French knot. So we're gonna do it on the I. Oh, I can't see where the dot of my I is. We're gonna make the dot of my I be about right there, okay? So from the back, I'm gonna bring my needle up where the dot of my I is. When I go back into my fabric here, I'm gonna end up going in close to, but not in exactly the same hole we went into before, okay? So in case it's hard to see here in a minute, this is what I'm shooting for, all right? Well, let's give it a go. I've got my needle and I have my thread on the me side of my needle, in between me and the needle. I'm gonna wrap it away from myself and around my needle 2 times. So here we go, away from me. 1, 2. So now I have all of this slack down here. I don't want that slack. So I'm gonna pull, I'm like pushing down on my needle and pulling on this thread to get my needle down close to my fabric. And then I'm gonna inch my needle back without losing those spirals around. Where are we? And then there we go. I'm going close to, but not in exactly the same hole. So here's one time when I will put my hands on the back of my fabric intentionally. I'm gonna push against this as I pull my needle through. It can be, kind of have to wiggle it. You're trying to get the eye of the needle, there we go, I got it, through that loop that you just made, that knot that you made, and it can be a little bit tight. So pull this through slowly because everything can get twisted up and it'll try to make knots that you don't want it to make. But there we go. Okay. What we have essentially done is made a knot, a French knot to be exact, on top of our fabric. If you pull it too tight, it might look like it gets sucked into your fabric. So you can bring your needle back up and see how I can, like with my needle, I can loosen that up. So you can loosen it if you need to, if it looks like it gets pulled too tight. French knot. It is the last step. Time to finish our hoop. So you'll take your big scissors, if you have them, and I'm gonna cut away the excess around my hoop. I'm not really worried about cutting, you know, these straighter edges. They're fine. So I'm just gonna cut away all 4 corners. We're trying to get rid of any extra. Here's what we have. I'm gonna I usually end up using maybe a little bit more than that arm's length that we get. You might want an arm's length and a half, but if you have already an arm's length, that's fine. You just will wanna make sure you get a fresh bit. We're gonna do what's called a basting stitch or a gathering stitch all the way around the outside of our hoop. I'm gonna start at the top, and unlike all the other stitching we've been doing, I'm starting from the top. My knot is gonna catch it there. And I am just gonna go in and out. So once you kind of get your groove, you can do multiple stitches like this. Pull it through. In and out and in and out and all the way around. This part always seems to me like it takes forever, I guess because it's the last part and I'm just ready to be done. And there's nothing pretty or exciting about this part, but it will make your hoop pretty and that part's exciting, so I take it back. What I like about finishing it this way is that you can take this fabric out of your hoop if you want to trade it in for a different word or something else later. So you can see it's already gathering because my thread was not super long. I'm almost to the beginning. And then here is where a handy little trick comes in. Let me get all this flat again. We'll pretend it hasn't gathered at all. So instead of ending here, these 2 pieces have not crossed or met. I started here, I've ended here. I'm gonna take 1 more stitch. So I'm gonna go down and back up. So now I have actually crossed over where I started before. Have you ever had those fancy drawstring pants where the drawstring actually crosses itself and then that way when you tie your pants you can get it nice and tight? That's what's happening here. Okay, so I'm gonna turn this over and now I'm gonna pull this so I have enough to tie. I'm pulling my short end. All right, now I can pull it nice and tight, and right now it's not, when I pull it, it doesn't stay. It doesn't feel fancy yet. But when I do the first part of my knot and pull, it stays tight. And I don't have to have someone come put their finger there for me and hold everything in place. All right, now I can just, for good measure, tie it a couple times and cut it a pretty little hoop. Ta-da! You did it! All right, Happy New Year. Put it somewhere where you'll see it. Put it somewhere where it's hard to say. Put it somewhere where you will see it, where you can be proud of the time that and I should be looking here anyway. Good grief, so much to remember. Put it somewhere where you will see it, where you can be proud of the stitches that you made over and over and over, and live up to your word of the year. and we'll see you next time. Okay, I did it. I think we are done.